I want to get into chapter 2 where we're going to talk about some other stuff. So thermal infrared imaging is really valuable. Here's thermal infrared images taken of Cydonia, the Cydonia region of Mars, where the face on Mars and that five-sided pyramid and a bunch of other really weird stuff resides. The cool thing that you can do with this is what was released, and I get into the skull, the cloak and dagger stuff that happened around these images, because we had been pressing NASA for thermal infrared images of Cydonia for years. And they had this Themis camera on the Mars Odyssey spacecraft, and they wouldn't give it to us, and they wouldn't give it to us, and they finally released this. What they released was a TIFF image, which is an uncompressed image, but it was just basically strips. And what you can do with that is you can then take them and put them through a process called decorrelation stretching, which I'm not going to get into, and you can lay these 9 different bands of infrared images on top of each other, and you can sort of magnify and add data to that. So in other words, things get even clearer. So we had a guy named Keith Laney. There was people from the Arizona State University actually came into the bulletin board and started training us on how to process this imagery. So Keith Laney did this. This is some of the color stuff that he did. And you'll notice right away that what you see is this pattern, again, this regular blocky pattern. This is Cydonia. This is an object called the Fort up here. That is the so-called face on Mars right there. And the D&M is down here. So this is kind of a side shot, but do you notice this blocky pattern? And we worked and worked and worked to try to get rid of this blocky pattern, and it just wouldn't go away. It wouldn't go away in the color. It wouldn't go away in the grayscale. It just kept coming out. And they were saying, well, we can't figure out what it is either. So what do you guys think? So what we finally got the idea to do, and here's another example of all the blocks. What we finally got an idea to do is take these, rather than block this out, we got the idea to take a visible light image and lay it on top of the thermal infrared image. This is a technique that's used in astronomy. It's called luminance layering. And what you do is you get like if you have a picture of a galaxy, in the thermal infrared and the visible light, and you put them together, you get a much clearer picture of what the whole thing really is. And when we did that, it ended up looking like that on the left. And it bore a really strong resemblance to the Phobos 2 data. And as we started to look at it, things started to jump out. This is an object on the left. It's called the Fort. We're going to get into that a little bit later. Here it is in the thermal infrared with the luminance layering. And then you can see that there's these block patterns were not just block patterns, but there appeared to be actual, I don't know, buildings that were there that you cannot see in the visible light. Here's a close-up of the same area. Notice this guy right here. This is a tube that runs underneath the ground. There's cross beams here, and if you follow it back to the opening, there's a square building here, and you guys see these entrances? See that little? You could walk right in there, catch the train, and it drives, and it goes right over to the base of another mesa, which may or may not be artificial on Mars. It looks like you could take the train to this other object. And as you get closer and closer on this, oh, that's not, did I want to go? It's not, okay, yeah, well, we'll talk about this. These tubes are similar to these so-called glass tubes that were found on Mars by Arthur C. Clarke and Richard Hoagland. This is an example of an image. It's something that was found that Hoagie made a big deal of. People say that people say that your eyes are being fooled. Okay, because when I look at this, it's pretty clear to me that there's a tube structure here, right? And then there's these white spokes on a very regular spaced basis that are supporting it. And then there's this really brilliant reflection here, which is really unusual. The only thing you're going to get a reflection like that off of is going to be glass or ice. Okay, so it could be an ice tube, which is really not something, there's really not very good examples of that anywhere on Earth, and there's not supposed to be any water on Mars, so how did it end up icing up like that? Or it could be an artificial structure, and what the critics say is that, oh no, your eye's just fooling you. This is actually convex, not concave. So it's exactly the opposite, and you're just crazy and you're just stupid. But what the idea was is that this might be something like this. It might actually be the Martian canals that Percival Lowell thought he saw, that Schiaparelli thought he saw, that came from the very beginning of the first observations of Mars. Maybe this really was some kind of water transfer system. And fortunately, they've finally taken some new pictures. The problem is the new pictures aren't any better than the old pictures. They look exactly the same, even though this one at the bottom is the original data from the Mars Global Surveyor, and this is the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. This is supposed to be a camera that's about 30 times better than this, yet the detail is exactly the same because they just don't want you to really know what's there. So again, here's an example of the tube. Wow, we're really just losing the color separation here. But again, there's this pattern of this whole, what looks like a city. And the problem is with the city part of it is that it's all under the ground at Cydonia. This is the big famous object here, the one I like the most.
Can anybody see that ram head on the left side? It's just a simulacrum, but it looks like the horns and the eyeball and the nose. Here, that's the eye.
Yeah, oh yeah, I've never looked at it like that. Yeah. But what's interesting is that all this stuff, and I'm not discounting that, but yeah, it's interesting. But what's interesting about this for me is that all this stuff here is that you're looking at, come on. These are all basically city block sized objects, and they are underneath the ground. And the problem is that with the infrared, you shouldn't be able to see that deep. So the only way that in the infrared you would be able to see these structures is, and here's another close-up of that temple guy right there in black and white. Well, God dang it. Okay, I'm not going to do that again. Here's a building in Minneapolis on the left and one on the right. And again, I'm sorry, you're really losing detail here, but it's, I promise you, if you go to my website, look at the pictures, they're actually better than this. You can see that there's this pattern, this vents in the top of this building, and this stuff is all underneath the ground, but you shouldn't be able to see it unless there's heat coming from it. So if there's heat coming from it, that means that the lights have to be on. Okay, somebody left the lights on when they abandoned this. So the theory became that there's a sheet, basically Cydonia is, the surface of Mars in this area is not the surface of Mars. It's ice with a little bit of red dust on top of it. And the thermal infrared can penetrate through that red dust and see what's underneath. Now there's a whole, again, cloak and dagger aspect to this, where on the left, after this data was downloaded by our processing guy at NASA's encouragement, they then switched out, and we can prove this, they switched out the data so that nobody else could download this version of it. And all they could get is this crappy, noisy version on the left. So in other words, what they wanted us to do is come out and say, we have a city under the ice, and then people would go back and try to repeat our work, and they wouldn't be able to do it because the data was all modified. And again, here's two examples. This is the D&M pyramid, one from Keith Laney's data and one from the NASA process data. There's some other things here that basically show that this is the Mars Orbiter Laser Altimeter, and it just shoots a laser beam on the ground. And what you can see is that in the graph at the bottom, this is what the actual laser did. In other words, this is where the surface should be. Right here, this is the visible surface, and this is what the laser is telling us the depth really is. So in other words, this whole city area is down underneath the ground, and the laser is confirming that because it's going all the way through the ice, because it can see through the ice, and bouncing back to the spacecraft. So again, just a few more examples. This is a pattern of these blocks, the temples. This is really just, there's various names that we give them. The train station. This guy, Banff, his username was Banff. He worked for Dr. Christensen at ASU. He's the guy who taught our guy to process this data, and then they've swapped out the information so that nobody could repeat the work that we had done. And again, just examples. This is Cydonia on Mars. This is a farm on the Earth. And I hope you can see that there's a lot of similarity in just the general block pattern. This is how you can tell that stuff has been modified by human hands or alien hands. Here's a close-up of another object there that's all squared. Again, it's not really good enough. Here's the thing that I wanted to do is what NASA didn't know apparently in 2003 is that there was something called the Wayback Machine. And they said, Dr. Christensen swore up and down that the data that they placed on the web, which produced these kinds of images, had not been touched. However, we went back and we looked, and it turned out that the web page had been changed once. Come on, mouse. The web page had been changed once on July 26, 2000 and what is that, 2? Okay, and it was actually changed. We had the time for it. It was actually changed. It was changed exactly 2 hours after our guy Keith Laney went in and downloaded our version of the data. And I went to JPL and I confronted Christensen with this, and he dropped his microphone. He freaked out. He's like, but he said, I didn't have anything to do with the image that has the artificial stuff on it. So it was just, I tell the story in the book. It's pretty interesting stuff about how they messed around with this. What they're trying to tell you is that this is all JPEG artifacting. And unfortunately, again, we lose resolution. You can't, well, you can see it. This is a picture of Dr. Phil Plait, or as I like to call him, Dr. Phil, who is a critic. And again, I apologize for making you look at this picture of him. But he's trying to claim that all this stuff that we see, all these blocks, all these buildings on these images are JPEG artifacts. And as an example, he showed a picture of himself. Why did he do that? I don't know. But this is a picture of him with these, again, you can see little square blocks. These are JPEG artifacts. The problem with his argument is that these images are not JPEGs. These images were TIFFs. A TIFF is an uncompressed file format, meaning that there is no compression artifact. So all these blocks were not produced by any sort of data processing. They were produced simply by processing the data according to the way NASA wanted it. And what that means is that Phil is a liar. Because Phil knew that the images all were TIFFs, but he tells his readers that they're JPEGs, and this is all just compression artifacts. So this is unfortunately the kind of person you have to deal with when you are talking about things that are outside of the mainstream. Okay, so again, here's some more of the data, some more of the blocks. This city is really big stuff. We were looking for nighttime infrared imaging of Mars. We never really got it until very, very late. At one point, the reason why you want nighttime infrared is because the heat is going to be retained at nighttime. There's going to be more contrast. So if you get a picture at night as opposed to that daytime infrared stuff, you're going to see more contrast, you're going to see more detail when you process it. This is an image done by Dr. Mark Collado, who did some early work on the face on Mars, did some really good stuff. And this is a comparison of what he had done earlier, which is a fractal analysis program, and the actual data from the thermal infrared. And what you found is that these blocks that NASA says aren't there, that Dr. Phil says are compression artifacts, actually showed up in the 1980s on a completely different data set. The same blocks, the same place, the same positions showed up. So the fact is this stuff is really there on Mars. It's subtle, but it's just under the surface. Here's a couple more examples. The difference between NASA's version that they put out after our guy downloaded it and the version that Keith worked with. These are histograms at the bottom. You see how narrow the band is on the left there? That's because they have removed information. Okay, they have pulled information out. The one on the right has a nice wide histogram, nice wide data band. That means that this has got way more data than that, and that's why we can see the stuff that you can no longer see on the website. So anyway, we eventually got nighttime thermal infrared images of Cydonia, and they had major problems. They didn't really have a lot of data in them, but again, we kind of tricked them. This is the nighttime stuff that they gave us. We kind of tricked them, and what we eventually did was, and by the way, this is what nighttime thermal infrared should look like. That's Cairo, which is the Egyptian word for Mars, and the Nile River Delta, and Israel and the Holy Land. That's what it should look like, and it's pretty spectacular. And again, you can see this geometric pattern. That's what cities look like from space. Unfortunately, they only gave us one piece of information, this particular data band, and it was not very detailed. It was full of noise. It was not anywhere near as good as it should have been. But we took it and combined it with the daytime anyway, and what we got was some really interesting stuff. In the nighttime infrared, there is no face on Mars. That's it right there. See that? It's not actually there. There was no face at all. It completely disappeared. But in the daytime, it was there. And what happened is that as you put this information together, you put together the daytime with the nighttime, you got something back. So you actually got an object that did manage to appear. This is what it looks like in the thermal infrared. And what we figured out was that they had done this to the nighttime data because it really showed that there is a very square base to the, very symmetrical base to the face. What happened next is that Mars Express went to Mars. In the mid-2000s, the European Space Agency sent a space probe with a high-resolution stereo camera to Mars. This is the Cydonia area. On the left is the so-called city. This is an object that we've talked about called the fort. This is where all that geometric stuff was, right about there. There's the face. These are a few other objects that are kind of unusual on the surface of Mars. And the really cool thing about their data was that they took pictures directly overhead, whereas NASA had always taken pictures from an angle. This is an enhancement of the so-called cat box image of the face on Mars. Anybody ever heard of that, the cat box? Well, if you read Ancient Aliens on Mars 1, I talk all about it. NASA basically took a picture of the face, the first one in 20 years, in the middle of the day in bad weather from below. It basically would be like if they took a picture of your face from this angle right here and in really bad lighting. And it didn't look anything like a face. It looked like, as Art Bell put it, something my cat would have scratched up in the cat box. And of course that went on all the 6 o'clock news. Remember, back in '98, the 6 o'clock news was still the way most people got their information. It wasn't the internet. It wasn't things like that. So there were no blogs really to speak of then. And so then they released it, and Dan Rather said, oh, it's just a pile of rocks, because Dan Rather's an expert. And 3 minutes after the 6 o'clock newscast went off, this image appeared on the NASA website, which is a little bit better, but still really crappy. But you could see some things. One of the things that was really interesting that you could see is that it kind of looks like you might have nostrils in the nose, which was really, really interesting and unusual. And we had not seen the nostrils in any other images until we got the ESA stuff. Here is a version of the ESA Mars Express. What I've done is really stretch the color out, and again, you can see that the face is pretty well symmetrical. There's an indication of eyeball and pupil in the right-hand side here, the right eye socket. And I'm like, wow, I think we got the nostrils back again. We're kind of seeing the shading, how it was intended to be seen. Other objects like the fort were photographed. This was the original Viking data, and people looked at this and they went, wow, there's a wall, an angled wall there on this thing. But as it turned out, when we got better pictures, there isn't an angled wall, but what there is this dark shadow. So again, this is the fortress, and just notice that this is the original Viking. This is Mars Global Surveyor, and then this is European Space Agency's Mars Express. Look at how much better this image is than this one. Yeah. See this line? You can actually see that there's kind of a triangular base to this thing. It's eroded, but it used to be a triangle. And anyway, when you have shadows like you had there on the picture on the left, when you have a shadow like that, why are those cast? Well, you don't get a triangular shadow unless you have a triangular peak, or you have a pointed, spiky peak. So these are examples of the Giza pyramids casting their shadows very long, late in the day. And here's another example of one of the pyramids there casting. That's how you get a shadow like that. So the thing that got me was, people, when they first saw the pictures of the fort, they thought, well, maybe it's not really anything at all. It's just kind of a big glob. But again, how do you get a shadow that creates that illusion of an inner wall? Well, the only way you can do that is if this capstone here on the top is shaped like that. It has to be pointed and spiked, even though it doesn't look like that from this particular image, to get that particular type of a shadow. So what I started to realize is that I think that this thing was at one time triangular or a tetrahedron, and it has collapsed in on itself. And the peak is still there, still casting a shadow. So this is an example of a tetrahedron superimposed on it. Here, the color is better. And again, God dang it. Again, notice that you've got a straight edge there, you've got a straight edge there, and then you got, I'm kind of thinking there is a sort of a straight edge there. Now what's happened is if you were to build this thing architecturally, you'd have a central column that would support it. You had columns coming up, just exactly like the Luxor. Have you ever been in the Luxor in Vegas? It doesn't have a central column, but it has. Now, what happened to this is that there's a landslide that came in from this side, and I think it broke this column here, it broke the central column, and then they collapsed, and that's what these things are sticking out. These are these columns that have toppled over. The top of it came straight down, and that's what's casting the triangular shadow to create this illusion of what they used to call the fort. Here's the DNM. On the left is the European Space Agency. On the right is earlier data from Mars Global Surveyor. I'm sorry, we're getting too much contrast in here. But again, you can basically see that it's got these very faceted pyramidal type edges to it. Here's two examples of 3D stereo stuff from European Space Agency created by them of the DNM. Looks just like a pyramid here on Earth. Here's a grayscale version. And again, it's eroded. There's stuff that has collapsed and sagging in, but there's no question that it used to be there. This is a thing called the cliff, which is on the, how much time do I have? 11. It's 11?
50 minutes. It's 10. 50 minutes.
It's 10.
10, 50 minutes.
50. Okay, we're going to go really fast. this is a thing called the cliff, which is on the far side of Cydonia, and it's a completely straight line. It goes on for like almost 2 miles. And it's built on top of this platform that has got all these sort of eroded out, scratchy, sort of excavated. It looks like somebody excavated this thing and slapped it on top of the ejecta blanket of a crater. I'm going to have to like whip through a couple of these things because I want to get to the really good stuff. This is a thing that NASA called a skull-shaped mesa, which doesn't really look. It's actually a symmetrical mesa that's eroded a little bit in Cydonia near the face. Here's another close-up of it, not too spectacular. At the base of that is this, which is a partially eroded, I think, tetrahedral pyramid again. You can see that there's an edge here, there's an edge here, and if you simply extend what used to be there, it used to be a little tetrahedral pyramid. And there's things like this, partial ones, full ones, all over the surface of Mars. Now, north of that is some other stuff that I think is really cool. One of my favorite ones is, well, there's a thing that looks kind of like an H. And notice that, whoops. Notice that if you were to fill this in where the green areas are, you would have basically sort of an H-shaped hangar or bunker. And there's stuff like this all over the place. Victoria crater?
Well, Victoria
No.
crater, the Curiosity one.
No, that's Gale crater.
The what?
Gale crater. Gale. That's where Curiosity landed. La Victoria is one of the named areas around there. Yeah, we're going to get to that in a sec. So again, this is a close-up of the top of some of these structures. This is one I really like. I call it the triangular mesa. If you look at it, it's eroded down, but it's kind of shaped like an A, and there's these nodules at the top, and it kind of looked to me like the Andromeda strain from the old movie. But again, I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying that if you look at there's a visual comparison, there's really this interesting sort of erosion, because what happens is everything erodes. It's called fractal erosion. And what that means is that things kind of erode down along the same patterns for which they were originally constructed. If you had a triangle, it's going to erode in a triangular shape. It's going to lose its sharp edges, but it's going to slowly still retain that triangular shape. And if you look at these things, they're very, very geometric, very unusual. Notice the T there in the upper left-hand corner. There's kind of this dark T thing on 2 different versions of this image. I don't know what that is. It's like a hole or a slot. Here is the ESA color image of the face. And you can see on the left that there is this eyeball thing. There's the hint of the mouth. There's a little bit of a hint of the nostrils. The 2 eye sockets align. Notice that this is an eye socket on that side. This is an eye socket. And this guy here, which I'll show you real quick, actually has a pupil and a tear duct and a bunch of other stuff. But they align. If you look at the other NASA data, they do not align. And that's because their orthographic corrections are incorrect. Here's ESA's version, or Mars Express on the left, and Malin's version, the NASA version on the right. You notice that the so-called right eye socket there is a little bit out of alignment. No wonder people don't think it looks like a face, because they've taken these things and completely distorted them. Here's Dr. Mark Carlotto's version, which is the worst I've ever seen. Now, there's all kinds of other stuff. If you look at these images, this thing, to me, that's supposed to be a crater on Mars, but it looks like it has an A in there. There's some weird tubes or something inside of this thing. I kind of look at it and say, it reminds me of that Apollo patch. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not something that is there or should be occurring naturally. A little bit later, when the European Space Agency did their stuff, what happened is that they produced some 3D versions of the face. The one that was publicized is this one, and it was made from, you notice at the bottom it says Malin Space Science Systems. Those are the NASA guys. And all of a sudden, this hump appeared on the forehead of the face on Mars, which made this the so-called Elephant Man version of the face on Mars. But if you look on all the other images, there's no hump. This is the one that was produced just by the European Space Agency. This is the one produced by Dr. Malin, supposedly using the same data. And you can see that there's no hump in the forehead. There's a close-up of it. I also think it's really interesting because if you look down here at the base, dang it, if you look down here at the base, yeah, that's really bad. There is striations and things that almost look like they're going off the face and into the ground. That is not visible in any of the NASA imagery, but it is visible in Dr. Newcomb. That's really his name, Dr. Newcomb stuff. Okay, so again, a few more images of the face. One of the things that was originally controversial was in Dr. Carlotto's enhancements that there were teeth in the mouth. If you look there, you can see these subtle little things. Now, if you were to take a picture of the face on Mars, and not only you had the eyeball and the eye socket, but you also had teeth in the mouth, it's pretty much game over. But when we started getting new pictures, there weren't any teeth. So everybody thought, well, it was an optical illusion. Also, the so-called teeth are way, way above the limitations of the data. In other words, they're not pixels. They're not just dark light pixels. And if there were, why did they only occur in the mouth area? It's really interesting. But what happened was, over the years, we lost the teeth. What I did is I went back and looked at different images, and I tried to put them together. Oh, that's a really bad color picture. Why did I put that one in there? This is what I'm talking about. If you look at the base, again, the striations are gone, but you see this very cloudy looking stuff here at the base. This is what NASA does, because I think some of the information here is stuff that they don't want you to see. And if you take the data and you look at it, it's all almost one color. It's as if they took a little airbrush tool and just airbrushed right over the top of that stuff. This is what it looks like in close-up. There is, again, a right-angled crosshatch pattern on this. That's not a natural aspect of a mountain. A mountain should not look like that, but it looks like some kind of mesh structure on the face itself. So what I did is I was like, okay, I wonder what would happen if I took some of the new images from Europe and put them over the thermal infrared and the other visible light stuff and started like adding them all up together. What would we get? And of course, the data's not really, you can't really see it. Promise you it looks wonderful on the web. But what happened was that the indication of the teeth came back. This is the eyeball, the eye socket. This is that collapsed area on the right where you see this geometric patterning. That's the collapsed area we looked at before. Here's another version of it. And again, you can see the two eye sockets and a little bit of a hint. You really can't see it on the screen of the teeth